Every single night, the same dreams haunt me. Each time I close my eyes, I'm pulled back to relive the same memories, over and over again. It's been more than 40 years since that time, but my mind seems stuck on one particular night. As pitiful as it sounds, life went on, and I went with it. At least, I told myself I had moved on. But really, my entire existence became focused on one thing: eliminating the source of my nightmares. Destroying the man made from mist. At least, that's what I believed. For years, I burned with the desire for revenge, craving the moment I could strike back. I endured things that would have driven most men to madness, pushing through every trial to get where I needed to be. Yet, when the moment finally came, when I had the chance to destroy him, I hesitated. Something cracked inside me, and a new kind of torment set in. Regret, guilt, and remorse. A trio of demons that have taken up residence in my mind. I fought desperately to wrestle control back from these tormentors, but no matter how hard I try, I always fail. I was too weak to carry out the purpose I'd built my entire life around. I let him go. In that fleeting moment, I told myself it was the right decision, a release from the burden of hatred. But looking back now, with the clarity that only hindsight brings, I can't be sure if I was right. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should start at the beginning. My name is Thomas Grayson, and I grew up in a tiny, isolated town buried deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The name of the place doesn't matter much, just know it was so remote, outsiders rarely came, and the locals preferred it that way. Life there was like stepping back in time. No electricity, no modern conveniences, and definitely no doctors. We were a close-knit community, clinging to the old ways and the ancient beliefs of our ancestors. We worshipped gods that most people thought were long forgotten, figures like Purin, Veles, Svarog, and Mokosh. What outsiders would call myths or folklore, we treated as truth, handed down through generations. In our town, there was no such thing as sickness. Or so we believed. If someone died, it was always old age or an accident. The elders told us sickness was something brought in by the modern world, by the outsiders. If someone passed away naturally, we said they'd been taken by the horned shepherd, led off to graze in his eternal fields. That's what they said about my grandparents when they both died within a year of each other. My grandmother followed my grandfather, they claimed, because her grief was too heavy to bear. But when people died young or in accidents, the villagers would whisper of darker forces at work. Evil spirits, curses, or malicious gods were always to blame. Disease, though, it wasn't real. Not until the day everything changed. It started with Boris Beard Bogdanov, named for the thick, graying beard that hung down to his chest. He fell ill, fevered, weak, and shrinking before our eyes. The sickness took him from a towering, broad-shouldered man to a frail shell in what felt like no time. The elders called it a curse, an evil spirit gnawing away at him. But soon, his entire family was sick too. Then others followed. Before long, half the town was on the brink of death. My father was one of them. I'll never forget the night death knocked on our door. It was a cold spring evening, the kind that sends a chill deep into your bones. I woke to the wind creeping into our house, the air cutting through like a knife. That night, the darkness felt heavier than usual, so thick, I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. A shiver ran down my spine, and for the first time in years, I was scared of the dark again. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was impossible. The black void seemed alive, its gaze pressing down on me. At just 11 years old, I was so frightened I almost wet myself. Paralyzed by fear, I couldn't see anything. And honestly, I wish it had stayed that way. I wish I hadn't turned my head toward my parents' bed. Because the second I did, everything I thought I knew about the world shattered. The sight before me stole whatever innocence I had left, crushing me under its weight. My legs gave out, and I dropped to my knees, trembling. My mouth opened on instinct, but no sound came out. I couldn't scream, couldn't even cry. I just knelt there, staring, gasping for air as tears filled my eyes. Every story I'd ever heard, the legends, the warnings, the so-called fairy tales meant to scare children into behaving, they all came rushing back. And in that moment, I realized they weren't just stories. They were real. All of it was real. As I knelt there, trembling and clutching at what little courage I had left, I saw it. A faint figure, barely more than a wisp of mist, crouched over my father's sleeping body. Its hazy form pressed close to his neck, with sharp teeth buried deep into his veins. It was feeding on him, draining him of something vital. Even in the oppressive darkness, I could see the creature clearly. It had a strange, malevolent glow, almost as if it wanted to be seen. I must have made just enough noise to catch its attention. Slowly, it turned to face me, rising to its full height. The figure was grotesquely tall and stretched thin, its limbs unnaturally long, scraping against the wooden floor. It was barely distinguishable from the mist surrounding it, like a nightmare given the faintest outline of a human form. But its glowing red eyes burned through the darkness, pinning me in place. Then it smiled, a wide, hideous grin. Its jagged teeth, stained crimson, peeked out from behind cracked, gray lips. A long, sinuous tongue hung lazily from its jaws. The image of that thing seared itself into my mind in an instant, branding my very soul with its horror. The creature raised one clawed, skeletal finger to its lips, signaling me to stay silent. Overwhelmed with terror, I couldn't even think of resisting. Tears streamed down my face, but all I could do was nod. Satisfied, the thing melted back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. It took every ounce of strength I had left just to pull myself off the floor. Even then, my body felt frozen, weighed down by a fear that refused to let go. I somehow crawled back to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, that blood-streaked shadow with its grotesque grin and glowing eyes. By morning, my father was sick. His fever raged, and I knew what had caused it. But I didn't dare tell anyone. Speaking out would have only brought suspicion down on me. In our village, if you were old enough to tend the farm, you were considered a man. And if you were a man, it was your duty to protect your family. Failing to defend my father from the man made from mist would make me guilty by association in their eyes. The shame ate at me. Every waking moment, I wrestled with the regret of my helplessness. And every night, he came back. The man made from mist returned, creeping into my home to drain more of my father's life. I would wake up, always in time to see him, watching helplessly as he fed, as my father's life slipped away bit by bit. The creature taunted me with its presence, as if to remind me how powerless I was. Every night, I promised myself it would be different, that I'd find the courage to stand up to him. But every night ended the same, with me on my knees, paralyzed by fear, watching as the monster slowly killed my father and chipped away at my sanity. Within a few months, my father was gone. At his funeral, I felt a flicker of relief, hoping that this torment was finally over. Maybe the man made from mist would leave us alone now, satisfied with the life he had stolen from me. But I should have known better. The world is cruel, and predators don't stop hunting just because they've fed. As long as it was hungry, it would keep coming back. One summer night, I woke again. The air was bitterly cold, far too cold for the season. My heart raced as dark thoughts clawed their way into my mind. I turned my head sharply, fearing the worst. My mother was there, still sound asleep and untouched. But I couldn't shake the dread that he had returned. That night, I didn't sleep. In truth, I haven't truly rested since then. The next morning confirmed my fears. My mother woke with a fever, her skin pale and clammy. I knew immediately what it meant. He had come for her, just as he had come for my father. I resolved to stay awake every night, determined to protect her from the monster. But the man made from mist never came back. Instead, he left me to watch her waste away. Whatever sickness he had brought upon her spread through her like wildfire. Day by day, I saw her weaken. The fever stripped her of everything, her strength, her voice, even her mind. She grew frail and pale, barking and clawing at the air like a rabid animal. She recoiled when I tried to give her water, and when I got too close, she lashed out, snapping her teeth as if she wanted to bite me. The rage that consumed my mother lasted about a week. She fought with an animalistic fury, lashing out at the world and clawing at the air, before finally collapsing into a deep, lifeless sleep. For 3 days, she didn't stir, and when the end came, all that remained was a fragile, skeletal shell of the woman who had raised me. While I watched this unrelenting force of evil tear my family apart, it felt as though my entire world had been set ablaze. By the time my mother finally succumbed to her illness, more than half the village had perished. Then came the Soviets. They arrived in strange, protective suits, their faces hidden as they moved swiftly, taking away any child they deemed healthy enough to survive. I was one of them. I fought with everything I had to stay behind. I wanted to stay in my village, in the only home I had ever known. But it didn't matter. The adults held me back while the soldiers dragged me away, their cold, metallic grip impossible to escape. I was taken from the inferno of my childhood and plunged into the alien world of civilization. They placed me in an orphanage, where the outside world began forcing itself upon me. It took years before I learned how to blend in with the city folk. Yet no amount of adjustment could heal the scars left by what I'd endured. The trauma, as they called it, was far beyond repair. There was nothing anyone could do to fix me, to patch the holes in my soul or make me whole again. But I adapted. And I found a purpose, a singular, unrelenting mission that kept me going, to destroy whatever had robbed me of my family and my life. That mission began to take shape when I overheard a conversation years later. They spoke of an ancient strain of Siberian anthrax that had reawakened, wiping out half of my village. The scientists dismissed the bite marks on the victims as nothing more than infected sores. But I knew better. It wasn't anthrax. Whatever had destroyed my village wasn't just a disease. It was something far worse, a monstrous condition that transformed humans into something inhuman, living corpses with an insatiable thirst for blood. Years of obsessive research led me to the only viable treatment, death. The only way to stop the afflicted was to extinguish whatever faint remnants of life remained in their bodies. My research often led me down questionable paths, many of which broke the law. It wasn't easy, but I pieced together the truth, fueled by a memory I couldn't escape, a dream about my mother's final days. In that dream, she didn't stay dead. I watched her rise from her bed, trembling and unsteady, before falling onto all fours. She growled and barked, her mouth frothing as she clawed across the floor. Slowly, she dragged herself toward me, her wide, wild eyes locked onto mine. She reached my bedside and, with a terrible, guttural screech, lunged at me, snapping her jaws. I cowered beneath the covers, praying the nightmare would end. But she bit down on my arm, the pain so vivid that it jolted me awake. That night, drenched in cold sweat and gasping for air, the pieces fell into place. At the time, I was a medical student, and I couldn't help but see connections. It struck me like lightning, a condition not unlike rabies but infinitely more sinister. What if the man made from mist spread a disease that twisted those it didn't outright kill? Most victims succumbed, but a rare few lingered in a death-like state, only to wake as something else entirely, something no longer human. I refused to believe this was supernatural. No, it had to be biological. The disease turned its victims into human-shaped parasites, preying on others to survive. They weren't superhuman predators as folklore might suggest, but poorly adapted creatures unable to coexist with their prey in the modern world. The symptoms resembled advanced tuberculosis, and that was how I found my test subjects. Death row inmates, accused of unspeakable acts, matched the profile. They were frail, emaciated, and yet, somehow, strong enough to commit horrific crimes, including cannibalism. Through some discreet connections with the authorities, I managed to obtain the corpse of one such inmate. When I examined him, I was struck by the uncanny resemblance to the man made from mist. His skeletal frame, his gaunt features, everything about him felt eerily familiar. But I dismissed the connection as paranoia. I should have trusted my instincts. The first mistake I made was noticing a slight twitch in the cadaver's muscles and ignoring it. The second was turning my back. While I reached for a scalpel, the corpse sprang to life. In an instant, its icy, bony arms were wrapped around my neck, locking me in a vice grip. Its strength was otherworldly, far beyond what any man with such a sickly frame should possess. I was choking, gasping for air, and I knew I was moments away from death. Then, through the struggle, I heard its voice, a hoarse, broken whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm starving." The words stunned me. They weren't just the growls of a beast, they were the words of a man, pleading through his hunger. That realization sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. My mind sharpened, and the paralyzing fear melted into raw survival instinct. Desperately, I grabbed the scalpel from the table and drove it into the creature's head with all my might. The scalpel struck true. His grip on me loosened instantly, and with a sickening thud, his body hit the floor behind me, knocking over the table as he fell. The moment I caught my breath, a wave of panic surged through me, something far worse than fear. My heart raced like it wanted out of my chest, and my mind spiraled into a dark abyss of incomprehensible thoughts. It wasn't just terror, it was anger too, a deep, primal wrath that I couldn't contain. Something inside me snapped. I turned on him, kicking his lifeless body over and over again. I didn't stop until his face was unrecognizable, reduced to a bloody pulp. Teeth, hair, and bits of flesh scattered across the floor as my boots stomped down, fueled by an animalistic rage I didn't know I had in me. When I finally stopped, I collapsed beside him, my legs trembling and my breath shallow. My body shook uncontrollably, and I sat there for what felt like an eternity. He was dead. I was sure of it this time. His head was crushed, his brain destroyed, there was no coming back from that. Logic told me I was safe, but fear doesn't listen to logic. I wasn't just shaken, I was consumed by a raw, visceral terror. That night seared itself into my mind, spawning nightmares I'd revisit over and over again. Each time, the dream took me back to that moment, forcing me to watch myself mutilate his body in increasingly grotesque ways. No matter how often I told myself it was self-defense, my heart wouldn't let me forget. It was like I'd crossed a line that no amount of reasoning could undo. I hate to admit it, but he was the first of many. And, in hindsight, he probably got off easy compared to the others. After I'd calmed down, I forced myself to complete the autopsy. It wasn't about closure, it was about answers. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. What I found was nothing short of horrifying. His heart was shriveled, blackened, and useless, a dead muscle that had somehow outlived its purpose. Shooting something like this in the chest wouldn't do much good. The heart wasn't keeping him alive. The lungs were just as bizarre. They showed signs of regenerating scar tissue, like they'd adapted to survive severe damage. The digestive system, however, was the most shocking discovery. It was a grotesque mockery of what a human should have, a system built for processing liquids, likely blood, with an efficiency that explained their dependency on it. Even with their emaciated appearance, these creatures possessed an unnatural strength. Their circulation was almost non-existent, relying instead on muscle movement to pump what little blood they had left. That explained the ghostly pale skin and skeletal frames, they were running on fumes, biologically speaking. My findings didn't provide much in the way of solutions, but I did uncover something unusual in his saliva. It contained a potent enzyme, similar to draculin, the anticoagulant found in vampire bats. It was like a cruel joke of evolution, or maybe history itself. These creatures were vampires, in every sense of the word. It was unsettling to think about how many of the old legends might hold a kernel of truth, but none of that mattered in the moment. I needed more answers. For years, I pursued my research through shady and often illegal methods. My tactics weren't noble, and they rarely yielded useful results. The one consolation was learning that these creatures were solitary. They weren't social, they didn't form groups or warn each other. That meant I could work without worrying about retaliation. It wasn't until the early 2000s that my luck changed. Around the time of the infamous Armin Meiwes case, I stumbled across something eerily similar. Someone had posted on a message board, offering cash for a willing blood donor. It wasn't for a transfusion, though. The poster explicitly stated they wanted to drink the blood, and, if possible, directly from the source. This was exactly the kind of lead I'd been waiting for. I reached out, offering myself as a donor. Of course, I had no intention of letting anyone drink from me, so I secured some bags of stored blood to offer instead. Working in my field made that easy enough. A week later, we arranged to meet at his house. I wasn't naive enough to walk into a stranger's home unarmed, though. I made sure to bring my pistol, just in case. When I arrived, the man seemed surprisingly normal, for someone who openly admitted to being a blood-drinking predator. He was polite, even friendly, though he insisted on keeping the lights dim during our meeting. At first, he was skeptical of my offer, but the moment he tasted the blood, he relaxed. To my surprise, we got along well. He opened up about his condition, explaining that life had lost its meaning for him. He couldn't form emotional connections anymore, the only thing that gave him any semblance of joy was the high he got from feeding. In a strange way, I related to him. My own emotions were dulled, replaced by a constant undercurrent of anxiety and disappointment. As we talked, I realized how much I'd sacrificed in my obsessive quest for revenge. I'd burned every bridge, cut ties with anyone who ever cared about me, all for a goal I wasn't even sure I could achieve. Despite the grim nature of our meeting, it was enlightening. He confirmed my theory that the infected are loners, avoiding others unless they're feeding. He also revealed that they enter long periods of hibernation to conserve energy, surviving for years at a time without sustenance. This encounter didn't bring me peace, but it gave me something just as valuable, clarity. I was on the right track, and I knew now that I wasn't chasing shadows. He confirmed what I'd already suspected, the infected despised bright lights. They preferred the shadows, living out their bleak and repetitive existence under the cover of night. But the most valuable piece of information he gave me was that the infected rarely strayed far from the place they first fell victim to the plague, so long as they had enough prey nearby. If food became scarce, they'd migrate, like any predator, and settle wherever the hunt was plentiful. As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice the sorrow in his crimson eyes. It wasn't the wild hunger I'd seen before in others like him, it was regret. A longing to escape some invisible agony that gnawed at him. I asked if he was happy with the life he was living. His answer was short, and it stung, no, he wasn't. I wished he'd turned the question on me because I desperately wanted to tell someone how miserable I'd made my own life. But he didn't ask. Still, I think he saw enough in me to understand. It was like looking in a mirror, he recognized the same emptiness I saw in him. In an unusual moment of compassion, I offered to end his suffering. His face softened, and for the first time, he gave me a real smile. He admitted he tried to kill himself many times but always failed. He wasn't suicidal, he explained, just tired. Tired of the endless, crushing monotony. Back then, I didn't understand the difference. I smiled back, telling him the secret to his survival was simple, his brain had always remained intact. He chuckled at that, calling it a cruel twist of fate, and confessed he didn't own any firearms. Well, you won't need one, I said, pulling out my pistol and aiming it at his head. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that felt out of place. And then I pulled the trigger. The laughter stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. His body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. Even though I knew this was mercy, justified, even, it became yet another nightmare to haunt me. This one wasn't as horrifying as the others. It was tinged with sadness more than terror, but it still weighed heavy on my heart. The thought of existing only to feed, devoid of purpose, was unbearable. It wasn't living, it was surviving. The longer I pursued my quest, the more I realized these creatures were still human in some ways, twisted and broken, but human nonetheless. They'd been robbed of their humanity by some cruel force of nature, reduced to beasts ruled by instinct. Victims of a curse, just like me. My obsession for revenge burned hotter. Armed with the knowledge he'd given me, I decided it was time to confront my tormentor. I returned to my home village, the place where all my suffering began. The journey was long, but eventually, I arrived near the outskirts of the village where I'd spent the first 11 years of my life. It was night, perfect for what I had planned. But standing there, overlooking the village, was almost unbearable. Every second brought back a memory I'd buried deep. The pain was overwhelming, as if I was living my nightmares all over again. Flashes of horror came flooding back, my father's slow, agonizing death. My mother's final moments, filled with pain and despair. And always, looming in the background, was that shadowy figure. Tall and pale, barely more than a wisp of fog, with those glowing red eyes that cut through the darkness. His sinister smile dripping with a red hue, like fresh blood. I was furious, blinded by anger and sorrow. Yet, beneath it all, fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. My body seemed to move on its own, leading me straight to him, as though we were connected by some unbreakable thread. When I finally found him, he was curled up in a den near the cemetery. How cliché, I thought, a monster sleeping among the dead. In that moment, everything felt surreal. He wasn't the towering, menacing figure from my childhood. In the dim light, he looked small, almost frail. He wasn't much older than I had been when he destroyed my life. It hit me like a punch to the gut, my memories had betrayed me. The monster in my mind had grown far larger than the creature lying before me. For a moment, I felt like that lost, terrified child again, staring at something that shouldn't exist. I raised my pistol, training it on his lifeless form. The power was mine now. The roles were reversed. He was utterly helpless, and I held his fate in my hands. But in that moment, when I could have ended it all, I froze. Looking at him, I didn't see the monster that had haunted my dreams. I saw a pathetic, broken thing, a shadow of what he'd once been. And I couldn't pull the trigger. I couldn't do it. My finger froze on the trigger, and in that moment, I knew the truth, it wouldn't change anything. Killing him wouldn't bring my family back, wouldn't restore the humanity I'd lost along the way, and it certainly wouldn't fix me. It wouldn't even bring relief. That bullet would have made no difference. Watching him there, frail and pathetic, I realized how pointless it all was. My nightmares wouldn't end. The anxiety, the hatred, they weren't going anywhere. Nothing could ever heal those wounds. I would carry them for as long as I lived, because that's what it means to be human. And as much as I hate to admit it, I pitied him in that moment. Letting him go, though, that was my mistake. Maybe if I had gone through with it, I wouldn't be where I am now. Instead of pulling the trigger, I did something else. I took a knife and cut a small piece of flesh from his calf. He didn't even flinch as the blade slid through his pale, waxy skin. It wasn't rational. It wasn't even revenge. It was just instinct. A need to assert some small, foolish dominance over the shadow that had loomed over me my entire life. But that wasn't the only reason. I kept that piece of him, stored it away like some grotesque keepsake, in case I ever reached a breaking point. If the weight of my demons became unbearable, I thought maybe it could offer me a way out, a quick, permanent solution. Eventually, that day came. My sanity frayed like a worn thread, and the will to keep living snapped. But instead of putting a gun to my head, I opened the fridge. I ate the piece of him, believing it would kill me. That the disease would rip through my body, overpower my immune system, and grant me the release I craved. But death didn't come. Instead, the man made from mist was reborn. At first, everything seemed better. My senses were sharper, colors more vivid, and every moment crackled with energy. It was intoxicating, exhilarating, and for a brief time, I thought I'd found something close to salvation. But nothing stays thrilling when it becomes your normal. Before long, the vibrancy dulled. The sharpness faded. Life drained of its color, until all that was left was a ceaseless, monotonous gray. Even my memories became dim, their vividness eroded until my nightmares were nothing more than moving pictures in an empty mind. They didn't hurt anymore. They didn't make me feel anything at all. Now, the only time I feel anything is in the fleeting moments when I feed. When I sink my teeth into the neck of some unlucky drunk, their warm blood offering a momentary flicker of something, pleasure, life, meaning. But it never lasts. The rest of my days are flat, colorless, and empty. The occasional streak of red is never enough to paint over the endless gray. I lost my pistol somewhere along the way, so I don't even have a way out of this misty purgatory. It's not all bad. But I miss feeling. I miss the sting of nightmares and the ache of sorrow. Because without those, what's the point of revisiting the past? What's the purpose of a tragedy if it can't move you? What's the use of reliving blood-soaked memories that bring no weight, no catharsis? There is none. I've chased everything I ever thought I wanted, and yet, whenever I reach for something, anything, it slips through my fingers like smoke. Now, only in the suffocating stillness of this unending emptiness, do I truly understand what horror is. Real horror isn't a creature or a man. It isn't something lurking in the shadows or crawling under your skin. Horror is the man made from mist. A fear so strange, so cruel, that it exists only to haunt those cursed with sentience. A void so relentless, it consumes everything, your joy, your pain, your humanity, leaving nothing behind but an endless longing for something you'll never hold. And in that emptiness, I remain.